The ballroom fell silent when the little girl ran. Not toward her mother, not toward the exit, not toward any of the 12 trained security personnel positioned around the most expensive charity gala of the year. She ran toward the janitor. 8 years old, nonverbal in crowds, never comfortable with strangers, Lila Ashford crossed 200 feet of marble flooring and sat down beside a man holding a mop. And then she started talking to him. Her mother, 30-year-old billionaire, Vivienne Ashford, stood frozen in her $12,000 gown, while 500 of the world's wealthiest people watched in silence. Because in that moment, every dollar she had ever made meant absolutely nothing. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Callaway Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was Vivienne Ashford's proof that a 22-year-old with $30,000 in student debt and a business plan written on the back of a lease agreement could build something that mattered. The lobby alone had been featured in 4 architecture magazines. The marble floors were imported from quarries in Portugal. The chandeliers custom commissioned, hand-blown cast everything below in a warm amber that made people feel, without quite knowing why, that they had arrived somewhere significant. Tonight, the Callaway's Grand Ballroom held 512 guests, 3 open bars, a catering setup that had required 11 months of advance booking, and the single most important investor presentation of Vivienne's professional life. The Ashford Development Group's northern expansion, 12 mixed-use properties across 6 cities, projecting returns that her finance team had called conservative and her competitors had called impossible, was being unveiled tonight. The investors in this room controlled enough combined capital to build small nations. Getting them in the same space had taken 2 years of relationship management, favors traded, and a charity partnership with the Children's Literacy Foundation that gave everyone a socially acceptable reason to attend. Vivienne had planned for every variable. She had not planned for Lila. Her daughter was supposed to be upstairs. Suite 14, 32nd floor, with her overnight caregiver Donna, a woman who had worked with neurodivergent children for 19 years, and who Vivienne trusted more than most of the executives currently circulating the ballroom below. The plan was simple. Lila would eat dinner in the suite, watch a nature documentary, and be asleep before the presentation began at 9. That was the plan. At 7:47, Vivienne's earpiece crackled. Ms. Ashford. It was Brennan Shaw, her head of security. Former military, built like something assembled rather than born, and possessed of a flat, unreadable voice that Vivienne had learned to read anyway after 4 years of working together. When he used that particular tone, careful, deliberately neutral, something had gone sideways. There's a situation in the East Corridor. Vivienne was mid-sentence with a hedge fund manager from Singapore. She smiled, excused herself with the kind of graceful efficiency that took years to develop, and pressed the earpiece. What kind of situation? Your daughter is in the building. Vivienne stopped walking. How? She told Donna she needed the restroom. When Donna stepped outside the suite, Lila got into the service elevator. She's been in the East Corridor for approximately a pause. 11 minutes. 11 minutes. 11 minutes in a building currently packed with strangers, noise, and lighting designed to impress rather than comfort. Vivienne was already moving. She found Lila near the entrance to the main ballroom. Her daughter was standing just inside the double doors, pressed against the wall, one hand flat against the surface as though verifying it was solid. She was wearing the pajamas she'd had on in the sweet pale yellow with small printed moons, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked impossibly small against the scale of the ballroom behind her. But she wasn't crying, she wasn't rocking, she was watching. Lila did this sometimes cataloged environments the way other children might collect rocks or cards. Processing. Vivienne had learned slowly and with significant difficulty to resist the impulse to immediately redirect her. The specialists had been clear. Interrupting the processing made things worse. Vivienne had spent years learning to pause when every instinct she had said intervene. She approached slowly, crouched down. Hey, Bug. Lila didn't look at her directly. Her eyes moved across the ballroom, tracking the lights, the movement, the patterns of people. The music is too loud, she said. I know. I'll have someone turn it down. The blue light near the stage flickers every 9 seconds. Vivienne looked toward the stage. She couldn't detect any flickering. I'll have that checked too. Lila was quiet for a moment. Then, without warning, she said, there were 2 men arguing. Vivienne kept her voice even. Where, Bug? Behind the stage. The small room with the gray metal things. She meant the equipment staging area. Before you came, I heard them. What were they arguing about? But Lila had already stopped listening to the question. Something across the ballroom had caught her attention, and whatever it was, her entire posture changed, shoulders dropping, the rigid tension along her jaw loosening by degrees. Vivienne followed her daughter's gaze. Across the ballroom, near the service corridor entrance on the far side, a man in a gray maintenance uniform was running a quiet floor polisher along the baseboards. He worked methodically, unhurried, no wasted movement, and he had turned the machine's motor down to its lowest setting, which Vivienne suspected was a personal decision rather than a requirement, since the party noise easily swallowed any sound at that level. He hadn't noticed them. He was just working. Lila took 1 step forward. Vivienne reached for her hand. Bug Lila stepped again. Then, again. And then, before Vivienne fully processed what was happening, her daughter was moving across the ballroom floor with the kind of quiet determination that brooked no discussion, weaving between guests and servers and table arrangements with surprising precision, heading directly toward the man with the mop. People noticed. Vivienne would think about that later, the particular quality of attention that rippled through a crowded room when something unexpected happened, the way 500 pairs of eyes could reorient within seconds without anyone making a sound. By the time Lila was halfway across the floor, conversations had begun to falter. Servers paused mid-step. A woman in a burgundy gown touched her companion's arm. Brennan materialized at Vivienne's shoulder. Do you want me to? No. The word came out before she'd finished deciding. Don't touch her. Just follow. She walked after her daughter. Lila reached the man in the maintenance uniform and simply sat down on the floor beside him. He shut the polisher off. The ballroom wasn't silent, the music continued. People continued talking. The clink of glasses continued, but in the immediate vicinity, everything had gone quiet. 3 of Vivienne's executives stood 15 feet away, expressions hovering somewhere between confusion and the particular social discomfort of not knowing what to do with their faces. The janitor looked down at the child who had just appeared beside him. He didn't look startled. He didn't step back. He didn't look across the room to find an adult to hand the situation to. He just looked at her. You like the baseboards, he said. Lila considered this seriously. They're consistent.
Yeah.
He glanced down at the section he'd been working on. I try to make them consistent. Vivienne stood 8 feet away. She could see her daughter's face in profile, and what she saw stopped her cold. Lila's shoulders were down. Her hands, which had been pressed flat against her thighs in the way they always were when she was managing sensory overload, were now resting loose in her lap. She wasn't managing, she was just sitting. His name, she would learn later, was Cole Maddox, 37 years old. He'd worked the night maintenance shift at the Callaway Grand for 14 months. Before that, 11 months at a corporate office complex 2 miles east. Before that, a distribution warehouse near the airport. Before all of that, before the ordinary jobs and the night shifts and the gray uniform, he'd spent 12 years as a United States Navy SEAL. None of that was visible on his face. Cole Maddox had the kind of face that didn't announce anything, which Vivienne suspected was a quality he'd cultivated deliberately. Medium height, broad through the shoulders in a way that his uniform slightly diminished. Dark hair cut practically short, lines around his eyes that suggested more sun than sleep, and something in the set of his mouth that was neither warm nor cold, just present. He was present in a way that most people weren't, actually. Vivienne noticed it even from 8 feet away, the quality of his attention. Most adults, confronted with a child doing something unexpected in a public space, defaulted to management. They looked for the right thing to say, the correct response, the social script. Cole Maddox wasn't running a script. He was just watching Lila the way you'd watch a storm come in from a distance, with interest, without fear, waiting to see what it actually was before deciding what to do about it. What's your name? Lila asked him. Cole, what's yours? Lila, good name. Lila processed this. My mom calls me Bug. Does that bother you? A pause. No, bugs are interesting. Yeah, they are. He shifted his weight, settling more comfortably against the wall behind him. Not sitting down maintaining physical space, but lowering himself enough that they were closer to the same level. You know what's interesting about beetles specifically? They've been around longer than dinosaurs. Most of them, anyway. Lila looked at him directly for the first time. 230 million years. That's more than I knew. You teach me stuff. It was the right thing to say. Vivienne knew it was the right thing to say because she had read 11 books, attended 4 seminars, and spent 6 years learning the precise vocabulary of what her daughter needed, and she still didn't always say the right thing. This man had managed it in 3 minutes and 17 seconds while wearing a gray uniform and holding a mop handle. The feeling that moved through her was complicated enough that she didn't try to name it. Brennan appeared at her elbow again. Ms. Ashford. His voice was carefully measured. Presentation starts in 40 minutes. Your investors are noticing the situation. Hargrove and the team from... I'm aware. We could have him return to his work area and I can escort Lila back too. She won't go. Vivienne kept her eyes on her daughter. If we push her right now, she'll spiral. You know that. Brennan did know that. He said nothing. Across the room, Vivienne could see Marcus Webb, her COO, a man she trusted, and sometimes liked speaking quietly to 2 members of the investment group from Seattle. His expression was measured and his body language was fine, but she could read the subtext from 40 feet away, containment. He was managing the optics. That was his job and he was doing it, but the words still landed in her chest like something dropped. Containing her daughter, she pushed the feeling back. Cole said something to Lila that Vivienne couldn't hear, and Lila laughed a quick, surprised sound like it caught her off guard. Vivienne hadn't heard that particular laugh in 3 weeks. She'd been counting, the way parents of children like Lila often counted the good sounds, storing them against harder days. She walked forward. Ms. Ashford, Cole said when she reached them. Not startled. He'd known she was coming, had probably tracked her across the room. I was just going to suggest we move toward the corridor. The acoustics are better. It wasn't a request. It wasn't obsequious. It was simply a practical observation offered to a parent who appeared to need information. Vivienne looked at Lila. What do you think, Bug? Lila was already standing. She walked toward the service corridor without being directed, and Cole fell into step beside her in a way that gave the girl plenty of space while still being clearly present. No hand-holding, no steering, just proximity. Vivienne followed and Brennan followed Vivienne, and somewhere behind them the ballroom continued doing what ballrooms did. In the corridor, the sound dropped by half. Soft lighting. Smooth walls. A long hallway running toward the kitchen and service areas, largely empty at this hour since the catering team had already finished their setup. Lila exhaled a long, slow breath that Vivienne recognized as decompression. Better? Cole asked. Better, Lila confirmed. He nodded, leaned against the corridor wall. He didn't make conversation. He just stood there, which was exactly correct, and Vivienne felt the slightly unreal sensation of watching someone else do the right thing with her child, when she had been the one spending years trying to learn how. After a moment, Lila said, "You have a kid." Cole looked at her. "Why do you say that? Because you knew to give me space, but not too much space." Parents know that. Other people don't. Something moved across Cole's face, not quite a smile, more like recognition. "Yeah," he said, "I have a daughter. She's 9. Her name is Piper. What's she like?" "She builds things. Model ships, mostly. Takes her all month to finish one, and then she acts like it's not a big deal." He glanced down at the floor. "She's also not great with crowds. Took me a while to figure out the right way to help her with it." Lila turned and looked at Vivienne. "Mom." "Yeah, Bug." He understands. 3 words, quiet, utterly without drama. They hit Vivienne somewhere below her sternum and took her breath away. She had spent so much. Not just money, though the money was staggering. Specialists and therapists and specialized equipment and school consultations and the sensory-modified suite she'd had built on the 32nd floor of this very hotel so that Lila could attend events without being destroyed by them. She had spent years. Attention. Sleep. She had read everything there was to read and tried everything there was to try and rearrange entire quarters of her professional life to accommodate the rhythms that her daughter needed. And in 7 minutes, this man, this janitor, who her executives had walked past 100 times without registering, had earned a trust that Vivienne sometimes felt she was still working toward. She became aware of Brennan Shaw standing at the corridor entrance behind her, watching. And beyond him, partially visible through the service door, two of her senior executives, Paul Gentry and Sandra Cho, lingering with expressions that Vivienne did not want to interpret, but was interpreting anyway. "I appreciate this," she said to Cole. "Careful, neutral. You can return to your work. We'll take it from here." Of course. He straightened off the wall. Then he looked at Lila. "Nice meeting you, Lila." "Wait," Lila said. Everyone waited. Turned to her mother, and her expression was the particular focused look she wore when she needed to communicate something that mattered and was afraid it wouldn't be understood. "Mom," the men who were arguing. Vivienne crouched down. "Tell me. I heard them say something about the lights. Stage lights. That they were going to make them go out." She paused, reconstructing. Her memory, when she felt safe enough to access it, was extraordinary visual, sequential, granular. One man said, during your talk, he said it would be embarrassing. He said you'd look like you couldn't control your own building. Vivienne felt something go cold in the middle of her chest. Stood. Her eyes moved to Brennan, who was already standing straighter. Then she looked at Cole. He hadn't moved. He was watching Lila with the same quality of attention he'd had since the beginning. Not reading her the way someone searches for confirmation, but actually listening. His expression had shifted in a way that was almost invisible, some small recalibration behind the eyes. "Did she say silver case?" he said. Vivienne looked at him sharply. "What?" Cole looked at Lila. When the men were in the room with the gray metal things, was one of them carrying something? A case, maybe. Metal. Lila's brow drew together. Then silver rectangular. Toolbox, but smoother. Cole was quiet for a moment. Where exactly was the service door they went through? And Vivienne realized, with a feeling she would remember for a long time, that the question wasn't idle. It wasn't the question of a man trying to be helpful. It was the questions of someone who already suspected something specific, and who was checking the geography against a mental map he'd been building since he first stepped into the building that morning. "East side," Lila said, near the stage. "The door with the red stripe on the badge scanner." Cole nodded once. He looked at Vivienne. "That's the electrical systems corridor," he said. "I was up there 3 nights ago. There's a main control panel for the ballroom stage lighting. It's not complex equipment, but you can do a lot of damage to a live presentation if you know where the right switches are." Brennan said, "Who are you?" "Cole Maddox. Maintenance." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "Ms. Ashford, I think your daughter heard something real." The ballroom music drifted into the corridor, muffled and distant. Somewhere past the door, 500 investors waited for a presentation that was scheduled to begin in 32 minutes. Vivienne looked at her daughter. Lila was watching her steadily. Not anxious, not needing anything right now except to be believed. Vivienne straightened. She looked at Brennan, then back at Cole. "Show us the corridor," she said. Cole picked up the polisher handle, set it against the wall, and walked. Cole walked like someone who had mapped the building in his head before he ever needed the map, not fast, not slow, but with the specific economy of movement that came from years of operating in environments where wasted motion had consequences. Vivienne followed 3 steps behind, and Brennan followed her, and neither of them spoke because Cole wasn't speaking, and somehow his silence set the terms for the corridor. Lila had stayed behind in the service hallway with Donna, who had arrived breathless and apologetic 6 minutes ago. Vivienne had told Donna it was fine and meant it, mostly, and had crouched down to look at her daughter one more time before following Cole. "You did good," she'd said. Lila hadn't responded to that directly. She was already reorienting, paying attention to something on the ceiling. But her hand had found Vivienne's briefly a quick, light pressure before letting go. Vivienne carried that pressure with her down the corridor. The East Wing service hallway ran parallel to the main ballroom, separated from it by 8 inches of soundproofed wall and a series of utility rooms that most guests never registered existed. Cole moved through it without hesitation, past a linen storage area, past a secondary catering prep station, past a circuit panel marked with a yellow laminated card that said Ballroom West Stage Left. He stopped in front of a door marked with a red stripe on its badge scanner, exactly where Lila had described. He didn't touch it. He stood in front of it and looked at it for a moment the way a person looks at something they're deciding about. Then he looked at Brennan, who has access to this corridor on tonight's crew rotation. Brennan's expression shifted, not threatened exactly, but recalibrating. He wasn't accustomed to being asked operational questions by maintenance staff. My team handled access credentials this morning. Maintenance catering supervisors, AV setup. AV setup finished by what time? 4:30. Cole looked at the badge scanner. Scanner log will show the last 5 entries. If someone badged in here after 4:30 who wasn't supposed to be here, it'll be on the log. He paused. Do you have access to that system, or do you need to call building management? Brennan looked at Vivienne. Get the log, she said. Brennan pulled out his phone and stepped away, speaking quietly. Cole remained in front of the door without touching it. Vivienne stood beside him, and the silence between them was the specific silence of 2 people waiting for information they were fairly sure was going to be bad. You've been in that room, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 nights ago. Routine cleaning of the panel housing dust accumulation on electrical components is a fire hazard. I logged it with building management. He was quiet for a second. The panel controls stage lighting circuits for the main ballroom. Also emergency lighting for the east section. If someone wanted to kill power to the stage during a live presentation, that room is where they'd do it. It's not complicated if you know what you're looking at. And if you don't, then you'd need someone who does. He looked at her. Your daughter said the case was smooth. Not a standard toolbox. Something purpose-built. That's not a hotel maintenance kit. Vivienne processed this. 28 minutes until the presentation. 500 guests in the ballroom. $43 million in potential investment commitments. Riding on the next 90 minutes of her professional life. Who would have brought in something like that? She said. Cole's expression didn't change. I don't know your organization. I can tell you what the equipment suggests, someone who planned this in advance. That case didn't come from a hardware store. It's the kind of thing you order for a specific job. Vivienne thought about the board meeting scheduled for 3 weeks from tonight. She thought about the 2 executives who had voted against the northern expansion in preliminary discussions. She thought about a dozen small things that had felt slightly off over the past 6 weeks. A leaked projection figure, a vendor who had suddenly become unavailable, a data room access log that her assistant had flagged and she hadn't followed up on because she'd been managing 4 other fires at the time. She thought about all of that, and she set it aside, because she needed to be here right now. Brennan came back. His face had done something small and controlled. Badge scanner shows 2 entries after 4:30. Janitorial staff at 6:15, that's one of my cleared crew. He paused. And a facilities management badge at 7:52. Who's badged under facilities management tonight? Cole said. That's the issue. Brennan's jaw tightened. The badge ID that scanned is registered to Derek Yuen. He's a building facilities manager, but Yuen isn't scheduled for tonight. He's off rotation. His badge should have been flagged as inactive for this event. The 3 of them stood in the corridor and let that settle. Someone used his credentials, Cole said. Either Yuen's badge was borrowed or cloned. He looked at Vivienne. We need to go in there before we do anything else. If there's been tampering, we need to know before your presentation starts. Not after. Vivienne looked at Brennan. Brennan was already pulling up something on his phone building security overrides. He badged the door and pushed it open. The room was small and functional. Gray walls. A main electrical panel taking up most of the far wall, covered in labeled circuit breakers and control switches. Fluorescent lighting, cool and buzzing slightly. It smelled like dust and ozone. Cole went straight to the panel. He didn't touch anything, just looked, moving his eyes across it in sections. Methodical. The way someone reads a page when they actually know the language. He stopped on the lower left quadrant, crouched down. There, he said. Vivienne and Brennan came closer. At the base of the panel, 2 circuit breakers had been covered with thin strips of electrical tape, the kind that would be invisible from standing height in poor lighting, but would hold the breakers in a false open position. When the triggers connected, both circuits would trip simultaneously. Both served the stage power supply. Also wedged behind the panel housing, barely visible, a small magnetic timer device. Consumer grade, the kind available at any electronics supply store. Set and left. Is that Brennan started? Timer relay, Cole said. You set the time, walk away. The panel does the rest. He looked at his watch. What time is your presentation, Ms. Ashford? 9 o'clock. Cole looked at the timer. He didn't touch it. I can't read the exact setting without moving it, and I'm not going to do that. That's your security team's job, not mine. But whatever it's set to, if it fires while you're standing at that podium, you lose stage power. Lights, sound system, teleprompter, everything. The corridor outside was quiet. Distantly, muffled through the wall, the ballroom music played. Someone laughed high and bright, the laugh of a person who had no idea that the room next to them had just revealed something deliberate and ugly. Vivienne stood in that small gray room and felt the specific sensation of something. She thought she understood, turning over to show her its underside. This was not a malfunction. This was not a vendor failure or a technical oversight or one of the 50 ordinary disasters that complicated every large event she'd ever run. Someone had stood in this room and made a considered decision about what they wanted to happen to her tonight. In front of her investors, in front of her board representatives, in the hotel that had her name on it. She became aware that her hands were entirely still at her sides, and that her voice, when she spoke, was going to be completely level, because she had too much riding on the next 25 minutes to be anything other than level. Brennan, she said, get the technical crew in here. Don't use hotel radio phones only, private line. I don't want this on any channel that's been running tonight. She looked at Cole. Can the timer be safely disabled without tripping anything? If your technical crew knows what they're doing with relay circuits, yes. It's not complicated. The tape on the breakers is the bigger issue. You need to restore those to active position before the panel will read correctly. How long? 20 minutes if they're competent. Less if they've dealt with relay tampering before. Vivienne did the math. 23 minutes until the scheduled start. She could buy 7 minutes on the program, a longer introduction, a brief additional speaker. Her COO Marcus could extend his welcome remarks. He was good at filling space when she needed him to. Do it, she said. Then to Brennan, and I want camera footage from the East Corridor from 6 o'clock onward. Everything. I want to know who was in this hallway and when. Yes, ma'am. She stepped back into the corridor while Brennan began making calls. Cole straightened up from the panel and came out behind her, pulling the door partway closed. They stood in the corridor, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Thank you, Vivienne said. Cole looked at her. There was something in his expression that was almost uncomfortable, not embarrassed, exactly. More like someone who found direct gratitude faintly difficult to receive. Your daughter's the one who flagged it. My daughter flagged it to you. You knew what to do with it. She paused. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have assumed she was confused or overwhelmed and left it at that. She wasn't confused. He said it simply, without emphasis. She was precise. Her description of the case, the badge color, the door that's not confusion. That's someone who observes carefully and retains what she sees. He looked at the wall beside them, then back at Vivienne. A lot of adults assume that difficulty in one area means difficulty across the board. That's usually wrong. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. You said your daughter has struggled with anxiety. Yeah. What happened to her mother? She watched him decide whether to answer. It wasn't evasion, he was just doing the genuine internal calculation of someone who didn't talk about this often, and was figuring out how much was appropriate to say to a stranger in a service corridor with 22. Minutes before a high-stakes business presentation. She died, he said, 3 years ago. Pulmonary embolism. Piper was 6. He was quiet for a beat, fast, no warning. The kind of thing you don't get to prepare for. Vivienne said nothing. She had learned, in 6 years of parenting Lila, that sometimes silence was more respectful than response. Piper didn't speak for about 4 months after, Coles said. Not clinically mute, she'd answer direct questions, basic stuff. But she stopped talking the way kids talk, stopped narrating her day, asking why things worked, telling me about whatever she'd read. She just went quiet. He shifted his weight against the wall. I didn't know what to do with that. I'm not naturally good at sitting with things. I was trained to assess and act. Silence felt like a problem to solve. What changed? He thought about it. I stopped trying to fix it and started trying to understand it. Piper wasn't broken. She was grieving, and she needed the world to slow down enough that she could feel safe being in it again. A pause. Took me longer than it should have to figure that out. I made some mistakes. He looked at her directly. We all make mistakes with the people we're trying hardest to protect. That's not a failure. It's just what it costs to learn. Vivienne heard that land somewhere she hadn't expected. She didn't respond to it, because she couldn't, not right now. She filed it away in the category of things she would need to sit with later. How did you end up here? She said instead. Night maintenance. With your background. Something in his expression shifted slightly. You know my background? Brennan ran your employment file when you sat down next to my daughter. Standard security response. She watched his face. Navy SEAL, 12 years, multiple deployments, a service record that is, apparently, not something you put on a resume. Cole looked at the floor for a moment. Piper needed stability. Real stability, not the kind where her father's schedule changes every 6 months based on contract work or consulting assignments. She needed to know that when she got home from school, I'd be there. That dinner happened at the same time. That Saturday mornings were the same. He looked up. Night shift maintenance pays enough. It's consistent. Nobody needs me to be available on short notice. I'm home when she wakes up and home when she gets back. He paused. The math I did. Vivienne thought about the math she did every single day and how differently it had turned out. She had a live-in caregiver for Lila, and a sensory-modified suite, and a team of specialists on retainer, and a schedule arranged by 2 executive assistants who understood that Lila's needs came first even when they didn't. She had built an entire support infrastructure using money as the raw material, because money was what she had. Cole Maddox had built his infrastructure out of time and presence because that was what he had. She didn't know yet which of them had done it better. She suspected the answer was more complicated than the question. Brennan appeared at the end of the corridor. Technical crew is on their way. Building manager is pulling camera footage now. And he stopped. Looked at Vivienne with the expression he reserved for things he genuinely didn't want to say. Ms. Ashford, the badge that accessed this corridor tonight. Derek Yoon's credentials. Building security cross-referenced with a master access log, and they found a secondary access point. Someone also badged into the AV equipment room at 4:45. After the AV crew was cleared out. Yes, what was accessed? The system doesn't log which equipment was touched. Only that the room was accessed. He paused. But the AV room has a direct data link to the presentation control system. If someone knew what they were doing, they could have gotten into the presentation files, or the investor data room access portal. The credentials for tonight's data room were generated this morning and distributed via the presentation management system. Vivienne went very still. The investor data room was where the full northern expansion projections lived. The complete financials, the proprietary market analysis, the acquisition target list. If someone had accessed that portal and pulled those files not to destroy the presentation, but to take something from it, then tonight was not about sabotage at all. Tonight was about theft. The sabotage was a distraction, or a contingency, or both. She thought again about the board vote, 3 weeks away. The expansion plan that 2 board members had opposed loudly and several others had opposed quietly. The leaked projection figure 6 weeks ago. The vendor who had gone suddenly unavailable right before a key deadline. She thought about who stood to benefit most if the northern expansion collapsed before it could be presented to investors. A name arrived in her mind fully formed. The way conclusions arrived when you'd been assembling evidence without letting yourself look at it directly. The name was Richard Hargrove, board member for 6 years. Minority stakeholder in 3 competing development firms, held through subsidiaries that were technically disclosed but practically invisible if you didn't know where to look. She had known where to look for 18 months and had chosen incorrectly. She now understood to treat it as a conflict of interest to be managed rather than a threat to be neutralized. "Where's Hargrove right now?" she said. Brennan understood immediately. "In the ballroom." He arrived at 7:15, been near the investor group from Seattle most of the evening. Keeping himself visible, establishing an alibi in plain sight while someone else handled the operational side. Don't move him, she said. Don't let him know anything is wrong. Keep someone on him without making it obvious. She looked at Cole. Can I ask you to stay on this corridor until the technical crew has finished? Cole looked at her steadily. It's your building. That's not a yes. Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of amusement, quickly suppressed. Yeah, I'll stay. Vivienne nodded. She turned to Brennan. I need 5 minutes in the corridor outside the ballroom to think. Then I'm going to find Marcus and tell him to extend his remarks. Then I am going to walk out onto that stage and give the best presentation of my life, and I need everyone to make sure that when I do, the lights are on. She paused. And I need someone to sit with Lila. I'll arrange, someone she's comfortable with. She looked at Cole. Is there any chance your daughter? She stopped herself. No, that's not a reasonable thing to ask. I'm sorry. Piper's with my neighbor tonight, Cole said. But I can ask Donna to bring Lila somewhere she can see the corridor entrance, so she knows what's happening. He looked at Vivienne carefully. Lila doesn't need to be protected from information. She needs to know she's not being kept in the dark. That's usually what makes it harder. Vivienne heard that. Really heard it. She had spent years arranging things so that Lila wouldn't have to experience difficulty. Building walls around her daughter's world, careful and well-funded walls, designed to keep the hard things out. And standing here in a service corridor while her gala continued 30 feet away, she was starting to understand that some of what she'd built might not have been walls so much as distance. She didn't say any of this. She filed it in the same place as everything else from this conversation that she was not ready to look at directly. Tell Donna to bring her to the main corridor, she said. Let Lila know we found what she described. Tell her she was right. She paused. Make sure she hears that part. Cole nodded. Vivienne turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Her heels clicked against the tile in a rhythm that sounded more composed than she felt. Behind her, she heard Cole say something quietly. She didn't catch the words, and then the sound of him moving back toward the panel room to wait for the technical crew. She had 17 minutes. She used 3 of them standing in the quiet of the secondary corridor, with her back against the wall, eyes closed, running through the presentation in her head. Not because she'd forgotten it, she knew it cold, had practiced it until the words came out of her like breathing, but because she needed to feel the shape of it in her hands before she walked out there. She needed to remember what it was for. The northern expansion wasn't about the returns. The returns were real, and the projections were solid, and she believed in the numbers the way you believed in things you'd built yourself from primary research. But the expansion 12 properties across 6 cities, each one a mixed-use development with built-in community space and accessible design, was also about something she'd stopped saying out loud because she'd gotten tired of watching investors' eyes glaze when she used words like impact. Thought about Lila. She thought about the 32nd floor suite and the sensory accommodations and the extraordinary amount of money she'd spent making one room in one building safe for her daughter. She thought about Cole Maddox doing the same thing with nothing but time. She opened her eyes. 14 minutes. She found Marcus near the bar and spoke to him for 90 seconds, and he absorbed the information the way Marcus always absorbed things without visible reaction, filing it immediately into operational categories, asking only the questions that were necessary. He was already moving before she finished talking. She found Brennan at the edge of the room and got his update in under a minute. The technical crew was in the panel room. Timer relay had been isolated without incident. Breakers were being restored. Camera footage had surfaced a clear image of a man in a facility's uniform badging into the east corridor at 7:52. The face didn't match Derek Ewan's personnel photo. The badge had been cloned. The man in the footage was being run against building access records from previous events. Hargrove was still near the Seattle investors, glass in hand, laughing at something. Don't lose him, she said. He's not going anywhere, Brennan said. She believed him. She walked to the edge of the stage and stood there for a moment, looking out at the ballroom. 500 people. Ambient music at a comfortable level. Tables set with the careful geometry of an event that had cost more to produce than most people earned in a decade. The chandelier light made everything look slightly more significant than it was, which was the entire point of chandelier light. Somewhere in the East Corridor, a 9-year-old girl's father was watching a technical crew undo 40 minutes of someone else's careful planning. Somewhere in the main service corridor, Donna was explaining to an 8-year-old that the thing she'd described the silver case, the red badge door, the arguing men had been real, had been found, had been taken seriously. Vivienne thought she was right. Make sure she hears that part. She hoped Donna was saying exactly that. Stage lights came up fully clean, steady, no flicker. She heard the confirmation in her earpiece a second later. Technical crew had finished. System was clean. Presentation control was being verified now. 7 minutes. She walked back to the main corridor entrance to check on Lila. Her daughter was sitting on a small folding chair that Donna had produced from somewhere, positioned near the corridor entrance where she could see down both hallways, but wasn't in the traffic flow of the event. She had a bottle of water and one of her small notebooks, the one she used to draw patterns in when she needed to organize her thinking. She looked up when Vivienne approached. "They found it?" she said. "They found it. Exactly where you said." Vivienne crouched down. The silver case. The door with the red stripe. All of it. Lila absorbed this with the particular stillness she had when something had resolved correctly. "The men were going to make you look bad," she said. "We're trying to. Because they want something from your company." Vivienne paused. "What makes you say that?" "Because in the nature documentary about wolves, the reason one wolf undermines another wolf isn't because of the first wolf specifically. Because of what the first wolf has." Lila looked at her notebook. "You have something they want. They can't get it while you're strong. So they try to make you look weak." Vivienne looked at her daughter, this 8-year-old, who had just explained corporate sabotage through wolfpack ecology, and felt the complicated love of a parent confronted with a mind they can't entirely follow. "You're right," she said. "Cole said that too, that I was right." Lila paused. "He said it before you came back." Vivienne glanced down the corridor. Cole was visible at the far end, near the panel room door, speaking with one of the technical crew members. He had his arms crossed and was listening, and even from this distance, she could see the quality of attention he gave the other person present. Direct, not performing patience, but actually practicing it. She thought about what he'd said. "We all make mistakes with the people we're trying hardest to protect. That's not a failure. It's just what it costs to learn." She was still learning. "I have to go do my presentation," she told Lila. "I know." Lila went back to her notebook, then stopped. "Mom." "Yeah? You'll be good at it." She said it the way she said things that she simply considered factually accurate. No inflation. Just the statement. You practice things until you're good at them. I've watched you. Vivienne stood up. Her throat did something she didn't have time for right now, so she held it still. "Thanks, Bug." She walked back toward the ballroom. $500 million in projected development value. 12 properties, 6 cities. A board vote in 3 weeks that was going to go differently now, whether Richard Hargrove understood that yet or not. She stepped onto the stage. The lights held. She began to speak. The presentation ran 91 minutes. Vivienne had rehearsed it for 60. She had not planned to go over, but somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when the first questions started coming from the floor, real questions, the kind investors only asked when they were already in, she understood that the room had shifted in a way that couldn't be rushed. So she let it run. She answered every question directly, without the diplomatic softening that her communications coach had spent 2 years trying to get her to use more consistently. She used numbers when numbers were the answer, and she used plain language when they weren't. And by the time she walked off that stage at 10:47, Marcus was waiting in the wings with an expression she had seen exactly twice in 4 years of working together. "Seattle Group wants to schedule a follow-up before month end," he said. "Soon." They said, "as soon as you're available." "That's a quote." She nodded. "Get it on the calendar." "And the Meridian Group? Flagstaff wants to see the Phase 2 projections. I told them we'd send the data room access by end of week." He paused. "Hargrove left early. About 40 minutes into your presentation. Brennan's team tracked him to the parking structure. Let him go tonight," she said. "He's not going anywhere that matters." Marcus looked at her. He'd been her COO for 4 years, and he knew her well enough to read the specific quality of her certainty when it was real versus performed. This was real. You want to tell me what happened in that corridor? Tomorrow morning. My office. 7 o'clock. Bring the board meeting prep files and the subsidiary disclosure records for every current board member. She looked at him steadily. All of them. Not just Hargrove. Marcus took that in without comment. That was one of his better qualities. 7 o'clock, he said, and walked away. Vivienne stood in the wings for a moment alone. The ballroom beyond was transitioning into its final social hour. The music had returned at the lower register she'd requested earlier. The catering staff were circulating with dessert trays, and the ambient noise had settled into the comfortable register of people who had spent a productive evening together and were in no hurry to leave. She had done the thing she came here to do. The lights had held. She let herself have about 30 seconds of feeling that, and then she went to find her daughter. Lila was where Donna had left her, in the small corridor alcove, with her notebook and her water bottle, but she was no longer alone. Cole had pulled a folding chair from somewhere and was sitting beside her, and the two of them appeared to be deep in a conversation about something that involved Lila drawing a pattern of hexagons in her notebook, while Cole watched with the expression of someone genuinely interested in what the pattern meant. Vivienne stopped at the entrance to the alcove and didn't interrupt. It's like a honeycomb, Lila was explaining, but the angles are slightly off, so it's not a true hexagonal tessellation. See? She pointed at a section of the drawing. These two share a side that's longer than the others, which means the whole structure would be slightly unstable. But interesting. Interesting beats stable most of the time, Cole said. Lila considered this seriously. Not for load-bearing structures. True. But for drawings? For drawings, it's okay. She added another hexagon to the edge of the pattern. Piper builds ships. Does she ever make them slightly wrong on purpose? I've never asked her that. I'll ask her. I think she probably does, Lila said. Builders usually make things slightly wrong on purpose. The wrong part is the part they're interested in. Cole was quiet for a moment. You know, I never thought about it that way. Most people don't, Lila said, without any particular weight to it. Just another fact. Vivienne stepped into the alcove. Lila looked up, and her assessment of her mother's condition was immediate and accurate in the way her assessments usually were. You were good at it, she said. I think so. We'll see. Vivienne looked at Cole. He'd stood when she entered an old reflex, she guessed, the kind that stuck around long after the context that built it. Thank you for staying with her. She was telling me about tessellation. He looked at Lila's notebook. I learned something. He didn't pretend, Lila said. He actually wanted to know. Vivienne looked between the two of them. I noticed. The corridor was quiet around them. Distantly, the ballroom noise continued, but here in the alcove it was just the three of them, and the soft fluorescent hum overhead, and Lila's careful hexagons. It was, Vivienne thought, one of the stranger moments she'd had in a very long time standing in a service corridor of her own hotel, at the end of the most professionally significant evening of her year, with a man she'd met 2 hours ago, and her daughter who almost never sat this comfortably with anyone she didn't know. The technical crew confirmed everything is clean, she said to Cole, and building security pulled the footage they needed. They have a clear image of the man who used the cloned badge. Cole nodded. Good. The device would have triggered at 9:03. 18 seconds into my opening remarks. Something moved across his expression, brief, controlled. Calculated, he said. Very. Enough time for the room to be fully settled and the cameras rolling. She paused. The humiliation would have been documented. Cole said nothing, which was the correct response. We also found evidence of a secondary access to the AV control room, she continued. Someone may have attempted to access the investor data room through the presentation management system. We're still determining what was taken, if anything. She looked at him carefully. The man in the footage is being identified. When we know who he is, we'll know who hired him. You already know who hired him, Cole said. It wasn't a question. Vivienne didn't treat it like one. I have a strong idea, yes. But you need the documentation before you move. I need the documentation before I move, she agreed. Acting on instinct alone, even correct instinct tends to create liability rather than resolution. She paused. Believe me, I've learned that one. Cole looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize the particular quality of attention he gave when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking rather than the thing that was appropriate to say. She'd seen it twice in the corridor and now again here. "What?" She said. "Nothing. It's not my business." "Say it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "You just ran one of the biggest presentations of your professional life, 6 minutes, after finding out someone tried to sabotage it. You dealt with your daughter's crisis and a security threat and a potential data breach, and then you walked out on that stage and apparently did it well." He looked at her. "And now you're here, in this corridor, talking through your operational response. That's impressive. Genuinely. But I'm noticing you haven't stopped moving for about 2 hours." Vivienne felt that observation settle in a way she hadn't expected. "I stop moving when there's nothing left to manage," she said. "Is there ever nothing left to manage?" She didn't answer that. The answer was no, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud in a service corridor felt like more than she'd bargained for tonight. Instead, she crouched down beside Lila. "You ready to go upstairs, bug?" Lila capped her pen. She looked at Cole. "Will I see you again?" The directness of it, no preamble, no social softening, landed in the alcove like something clean. Lila had no apparatus for asking things obliquely. She asked what she meant and waited for an honest answer. Cole looked at Vivienne, then at Lila. "I'm here most nights," he said. "I don't know what your schedule is." "My schedule changes," Lila said. "But I could find out when you're here and come on one of those nights." "Lila," Vivienne said gently. "It's not unreasonable," Lila said. "We were having a good conversation. Good conversation should be continued." She looked at her notebook. "That's just logical." Cole said, "I'm here Tuesday through Saturday. 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. Lila nodded, filing this. "Okay." Vivienne looked at Cole over her daughter's head. He met her eyes briefly, and neither of them said anything, and then Vivienne straightened up and took Lila's hand and walked her back toward the service elevator. Corridor entrance, Lila turned back once. "Thank you for listening," she said to Cole. He nodded. "Thank you for talking." The morning after the gala, Richard Hargrove sent Vivienne's office a brief email flagged from his personal account, not his board correspondence address, expressing that he hoped the event had gone well, and that he looked forward to reviewing the formal investor report. The email was timestamped at 6:43 a.m. Vivienne read it at her desk at 6:57, standing up, still in her coat, while her coffee cooled untouched beside the keyboard. She read it twice, then forwarded it to her legal team with a single line, "Preserve this thread." At 7 o'clock, Marcus arrived with the files she'd requested. They spent 3 hours at the conference table in her office, going through every board member's subsidiary disclosure, cross-referencing with the acquisition target list for the northern expansion, and tracing the specific overlap between Hargrove's investment positions and 3 of the 12 properties on the expansion roster. It wasn't subtle once you were actually looking. The disclosure forms were technically compliant, filed correctly, using the required language, buried in exhibits that were designed to be read by lawyers, and therefore reliably never read by anyone. But the exposure was real. If the northern expansion succeeded and Ashford Group acquired those 3 properties, 2 of Hargrove's subsidiary firms lost their option agreements on the same land. The window for those agreements expired in 4 months. Hargrove hadn't been trying to steal the expansion. He had been trying to kill it. Kill the presentation, damage investor confidence, force a delay past the option expiration date, and let the subsidiary agreements mature into something he could then offer to sell back to Vivienne at a price she'd have no choice but to pay. It was patient, methodical, and would have worked perfectly if an 8-year-old girl hadn't wandered backstage and heard the wrong conversation through a thin equipment room wall. He had 2 board allies, Marcus said, pulling a page from the stack. Renata Osei and Douglas Firth. Neither of them was directly involved in the sabotage, I don't think, but both voted against the expansion in preliminary discussions, and both have had sidebar conversations with Hargrove in the past 6 weeks that are internal. Meeting logs place outside normal board channels. That's not evidence of coordination, Vivienne said. No, but it's context. Marcus set the page down. You move against Hargrove, Osei, and Firth are going to circle wagons. You need to think about whether you go through the board or around it. I go through it. She looked at him. I go through it correctly, with documentation, with legal counsel present, and I give Hargrove the opportunity to resign before it becomes a formal removal proceeding. She paused. Not because I owe him the grace, because I don't want any ambiguity about who handled this properly. Marcus looked at her. He's going to fight it. He's going to try. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Schedule a board session for 10 days out. Emergency agenda, don't give details in the notice. Just mark it as a governance matter requiring full attendance. And I want outside counsel present from the beginning, not as an afterthought. Understood. He made a note. Then, without looking up, the man who was in the corridor last night. The maintenance worker. Vivienne said nothing. He's in the incident report Brennan filed this morning. Marcus set his pen down. I read it on the way in. His background is not what you'd expect. No. Brennan's recommendation is to offer him a role in the security division. Given his service record, I'm aware of Brennan's recommendation. What's yours? Vivienne turned her coffee cup in her hands. I don't know yet, she said, which was honest. She was still working through what last night had been, and she needed to separate the professional consideration from the other thing, the harder, less categorizable thing, that she was not ready to examine in a morning debrief with her COO. Marcus had worked with her long enough to know when she'd answered as much as she intended to answer. He moved on. By noon, the security footage had produced a name. The man who had badged into the East Corridor with Ewan's cloned credentials was a contract worker named Gerald Foss Freelance. No permanent address on file, with 2 prior charges for corporate espionage that had been resolved in civil rather than criminal proceedings, meaning he was technically available for hire and had no restriction on operating in the sector. He had been paid, according to the financial trail that Brennan's team and an outside forensics firm spent the morning tracing, through a shell account linked to a consulting firm that Hargrove's subsidiary network used for operational expenses. It was enough. Not for a criminal conviction that would take longer and required prosecutors who moved at a different pace than Vivienne did. But it was enough for a board proceeding. It was enough for the kind of documentation that made fighting both futile and expensive. Vivienne's legal team said, "This is solid." Vivienne said, "Good. Let's move." What she did not do, in that 12-hour run from morning through evening, was think about Cole Maddox. She was aware of not thinking about him the way you were aware of a word you'd decided not to say by the shape of the space where it would have been. She thought about Lila. Lila, who had sat in a ballroom alcove with a man she'd known for 90 minutes and talked to him about tessellation, with the ease she almost never demonstrated with people she hadn't known for years. Lila, who had said he understands as though it were a simple fact, the same way she said bugs are interesting or the music is too loud. Lila, who had asked to see him again with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that wanting something openly was supposed to be complicated. Vivienne had learned that lesson early and thoroughly. Somewhere in the years of building a company and raising a child alone, she had developed the habit of wanting things privately and pursuing them efficiently and never allowing the gap between the two to be visible. It was a useful habit for a CEO. It was possibly less useful for a person. She thought about the question Cole had asked, "Is there ever nothing left to manage?" She thought about the fact that she hadn't answered it. At 4 in the afternoon, she called the Callaway Grand's Facilities Management Office and asked for Cole Maddox's supervisor. The supervisor, a man named Phil, who sounded faintly alarmed at receiving a direct call from the building owner, confirmed that Cole was scheduled to begin his shift at 7 that evening. "I need to meet with him," Vivienne said, "before his shift starts, if possible." In the executive conference room on the 2nd floor. Phil said he would pass the message along. Vivienne hung up and looked out her office window at the city below. It was the kind of afternoon where the light came in at a low angle and made everything look more deliberate than it probably was: the traffic, the pedestrians, the geometry of buildings arranged against each other without particular plan, just accumulation. She had no idea what she was going to say to him. She made a list of what she should say to him. "Thank you. Your assistance last night was valuable. We'd like to discuss a potential role in our security division. Please speak with Brennan about the details." Professional, clean, appropriate. She looked at the list and acknowledged to herself that it was not what she was actually going to say. Cole arrived at 6:45. He'd changed into clean clothes, dark jeans, a gray shirt that was neither formal nor casual, the kind of clothing that made no particular statement. He sat across from her at the conference table and didn't make small talk, which she had come to appreciate about him in remarkably short span of time. "How's Lila?" he said. "First thing, good. She slept better than I expected." Vivienne paused. She talked about the hexagon conversation at breakfast. "Said you were," and I quote, "a credible listener." Cole's expression did the thing again, the fractional shift, the almost smile. "That's the best review I've gotten in a while. It is from Lila." Vivienne folded her hands on the table. "I want to talk to you about last night, and about what comes next."
Okay.
"Brennan has recommended offering you a position in the security division. Senior operations role, based on your background and what you demonstrated last night." She watched his face. "I'm not here to make that offer." Something shifted in his eyes. "Not relief, something more complicated than that." "Why not?" "Because I'm not sure it's the right offer. And I'd rather talk to you first than assume." He looked at her for a moment.
"You looked up my service record?"
"Yes. Then you know it's probably the most qualified I'd be for any role in your company." "Maybe. But qualified and right aren't always the same thing." She kept her voice even. "You took a night maintenance job that paid enough and left you home for your daughter. You've been making that same calculation, in one form or another, for 3 years. I don't want to make you an offer that sounds like an upgrade, but actually breaks the thing that's been working." She paused. "Tell me what works. What does your life actually need?" Cole was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated, gone too far past the professional edge into something he hadn't invited. But she was tired, and she'd been running on 6 hours of crisis management and cold coffee, and she didn't have the patience tonight to be indirect about things that mattered. "Piper has school at 8, he said finally. "I need to be home before 7:30 to get her ready and walk her to the bus. During school breaks, I need to be available during the day. There's no one else. I don't have family in the city, and her grandparents are in Oregon, and they're not young." He looked at the table for a moment. "I like the work I do. I don't need it to be impressive. I need it to be predictable and to pay what it says it'll pay, and to not require me to be somewhere at short notice." "That's not a lot to ask," Vivienne said. "It's more than it sounds like." He looked at her. "Most roles at this level have emergency availability built in. There's always a reason you need to be somewhere on an hour's notice. That's fine when you have a support structure. I don't." Vivienne thought about the northern expansion. 12 properties. 6 cities. Each one designed to include community-accessible spaces, mixed-income units, the kind of development that looked good in a pitch deck, but also she had always believed this, even when it complicated the numbers actually needed to be built. She thought about what Lila had said about Piper. Builders usually make things slightly wrong on purpose. The wrong part is the part they're interested in. "I want to create something," she said. "Not just fill a role. I've been thinking about this since last night, and I want to think through it with you because it came from what Lila described what your daughter needs. What Lila needs. What the spaces we build either accommodate or don't." Cole waited. "The northern expansion includes a community program component. It's currently 3 paragraphs in the pitch deck and a line item in the budget. I want it to be more than that." She leaned forward slightly. "I want someone who understands both security and accessibility, not as separate disciplines, but as one thing. Who designs the safe room and also designs it to not feel like a cage. Who thinks about a child overwhelmed by a ballroom and asks what the building should have had ready for her before the crisis started." She paused. "That's not a job description that exists. I'd need to build it. And the person doing it would need flexibility on hours, and a schedule that was genuinely predictable, not theoretically predictable." Cole was looking at her, with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the careful attention, not the almost amusement, not the controlled blankness. Something more open than any of those. "You'd build a role around what Lila needed," he said. "Around what a lot of children like Lila need, and adults." She held his gaze. "But yeah, it started there." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'd need to talk to Piper. Obviously, she's 9. She has opinions. I'd expect nothing less from someone who builds model ships and makes them slightly wrong on purpose." That got an actual reaction, a real one. the controlled expression briefly coming apart into something warmer and less managed. He looked down at the table and back up. I'd also need to understand the actual terms before anything else, he said. What predictable hours means, what the emergency availability clause looks like, what the reporting structure is. He paused. I'm not saying yes, I'm saying I'm willing to hear a real offer. That's all I'm asking, she said. They talked for another hour. Not about terms those would come from HR and legal in a formal package, but about the program itself. What it could be. Cole had ideas that she hadn't considered, not because she lacked the intelligence to arrive at them, but because she had been approaching the problem from the inside, from what Lila needed. Specifically, as an individual, where Cole had been approaching it from the outside, from what spaces communicated to people who were already on guard, already managing, already deciding whether this was a safe place before any person said a word. The room isn't secondary, he said. The room is the first message. Before anyone on your staff says hello, the room has already told that family something about whether they belong there. He looked at the window. Most event spaces say, this was designed for people who find rooms like this comfortable. The accommodation is the add-on, the exception, the special request. And people know the difference between being designed for and being accommodated. Vivienne thought about the 32nd floor suite, how much she'd spent on it, how carefully it was designed, how it existed on one floor of one building and required Lila to travel to it in an elevator, while the event she was supposed to be part of happened on a different floor entirely. Designed for, she said quietly. Yeah, she had spent years building things for Lila. She was only now sitting across a conference table from a night janitor in a gray shirt, beginning to understand the difference between building something for her daughter and building something that included her. It was a harder distinction than it sounded. It required her to hold something uncomfortable, the possibility that some of what she'd constructed with such care and love and expense had still, at its core, been about managing Lila rather than listening to her. Cole hadn't said any of that directly. He hadn't needed to. He had just described what rooms communicated, and she had followed the logic to its conclusion herself. She was quiet for a moment. What did Piper do, she said, when you finally figured out what she actually needed, after the months of trying to fix the silence? Cole considered this. She started building the first ship, he said. I didn't ask her to. She just appeared at the kitchen table one Saturday morning with a box of parts she'd bought with money she'd been saving, and she worked on it all day. He paused. I didn't say anything about it. I just made lunch and set it next to her and went back to what I was doing. And at the end of the day, she held it up and said, Dad, I made this wrong on purpose. And I said, I know, and she laughed. His voice had gone quieter. That was the first time she laughed since her mother died. Vivienne looked at him across the table. She knew better than to speak for a moment, so she didn't. I didn't rescue her, Cole said. She didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to sit with her while she figured it out herself. He looked at Vivienne carefully. Lila's the same. I know. She said it with more certainty than she felt. Then, more honestly, I'm getting there. The conference room was quiet. Out the window, the city had gone blue dark, evening arriving in the way it did in this part of winter, fast and complete, the light simply stopping rather than fading. 7 floors below, the Callaway Grand's lobby was beginning its evening transition, the lobby bar filling, the concierge desk fielding the early dinner reservations. Somewhere in the building, the night shift was clocking in. Cole looked at his watch. I should go sign in, he said. Not apologetic, just factual. Of course, Vivienne stood. He stood. They were on the same side of an unspecified line they hadn't named yet, which was different from where they'd started this meeting and different again from where they'd started last night. Cole. She said it before she knew she was going to. Paused at the conference room door. She looked at him directly. What you did last night, it wasn't just the corridor. It was before that. The way you sat with Lila. The way you talked to her. The way she stopped, restarted. She said you believed her. That's what mattered to her most. He was quiet for a moment. She was telling the truth. Believing her was just accurate. It didn't feel like just accurate to her. Vivienne paused. Felt like someone deciding she was worth listening to. Something in his expression was very still. She is, he said. And then he nodded once and walked out, and the corridor door closed quietly behind him. Vivienne stood in the conference room alone for a moment. The city was dark outside the window. The coffee she hadn't drunk sat cooling on the table. The files from the morning's board preparations were still stacked at her end Hargrove's subsidiary records, the forensics report, the 12-property map with 3 sites circled in red. Everything that needed doing tomorrow was waiting exactly where she'd left it. She'd picked up her coat and her bag. She had a daughter upstairs who was probably still awake, still drawing hexagons or watching something about migration patterns, and who would look up when Vivienne came in and assess her with the immediate accuracy she always had, and would say something that was either very simple or very precise depending on what she saw. Vivienne walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the 32nd floor. She thought, I'm getting there, and she almost believed it. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Vivienne spent the 10 days between the gala and that Thursday doing what she always did when she was managing something that mattered. She worked the problem from every angle until she understood it better than the people who had created it. She read every document twice. She had her legal team run 3 separate reviews of the evidence chain, not because she doubted the first 2, but because she needed to know that when she walked into that room, there was no thread left loose that Hargrove's attorney could pull. She also, in those 10 days, did not sleep particularly well. Not because of Hargrove. She had handled difficult people before, and she would handle difficult people again, and the mechanics of a formal board proceeding, while unpleasant, were not beyond her. What kept her awake was the thing she'd been filing away since the corridor, since the conference room, since Cole Maddox had said she is, and walked out a door. She was 30 years old. She had built a company from nothing and raised a child largely alone and learned, through a process that was neither clean nor fast, how to live inside a life that did not look anything like what she had planned. She was not naive about what things cost. She was not prone to mistaking convenience for feeling. But she kept returning to that conference room, to the way he'd talked about Piper's first ship, to the way he'd described what rooms communicated before any person said a word, to the specific quality of his attention, the way it was never performing, never angling toward anything, just present and direct and genuinely there. She was aware that this was not the appropriate moment to be thinking about any of this. She had a board meeting to run, a legal proceeding to manage, a program to design, and a daughter who needed her full attention on the days she wasn't in school. She was aware that the appropriate thing to do was to set it aside until she had the bandwidth to examine it properly. She set it aside imperfectly and examined it anyway, at 2 a.m, lying in the quiet of the 32nd floor suite while Lila slept in the next room with the sound machine running. On the 4th day after the gala, Lila asked about Piper. They were at breakfast, the kind of low-key breakfast that Lila preferred, same table in the hotel restaurant, the same order, the particular predictability that structured her mornings. Lila was eating methodically and reading a book about deep-sea ecosystems, which was her current focus. And then she looked up without preamble and said, "Does Cole's daughter like ecosystems?" Vivienne set down her coffee. "I don't know. I could find out." She builds ships. Ships travel on the surface of water. The ocean has a surface ecosystem and a deep ecosystem. Maybe she's interested in what's below the ships. That's possible. Lila looked at her book. "I'd like to meet her." "I know." Vivienne paused. "I'm working on a project with Cole. When the time is right, I'll see if they'd like to meet." Lila turned a page. "When is the time right? When things settle down a little." Lila looked up. "Things never settle down. You always say soon, and then there's always something." Vivienne had no response to that because it was accurate. "I'll make it happen sooner," she said. Lila returned to her book with the expression of someone who had received a marginal improvement on an unsatisfactory answer and would accept it provisionally. On the 7th day, HR sent Cole the formal offer package. Vivienne reviewed it before it went out, not to alter the terms, which her people had constructed correctly, but because she wanted to see it as he would see it. The title was new, built specifically for the role, Director of Safety and Community Access, Ashford Development Group. The salary was fair, and she'd made sure it was, not generous in a way that felt like charity, but genuinely commensurate with the expertise and experience brought to the position. The hours were structured around a core daytime window with flexibility built into the contract as a protected term rather than an informal understanding. And the emergency availability clause had been removed entirely and replaced with a tiered notification system that gave Cole 24 hours lead time on anything non-urgent and a clear definition negotiated with legal of what constituted an actual emergency versus what most executives simply called one. She did not call him to tell him the offer was coming. She sent him a text. She had his number from the incident report that said, "Offer package from HR coming today." Read the whole thing. Ask questions if any of the terms aren't clear. He replied 20 minutes later, received. We'll review tonight after Piper's in bed. Then, 3 minutes after that, she asked me if I got a job with the building lady. Vivienne looked at that message for longer than she intended. She typed, "What did you tell her?" His response came back in under a minute, told her I was thinking about it. She said make sure she has good snacks at meetings. Vivienne actually smiled. It happened quickly, and it surprised her, and she let it. Typed, "I'll put it in the contract." His reply was a single period, which she would later understand was his version of laughing. The board meeting was a Thursday morning in February, in the Ashford Group's primary conference room on the 37th floor of the downtown office tower. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, and a table that seated 18, and a view of the city that was designed, Vivienne had always suspected, to remind everyone present how far they were from the ground. She had arranged the room differently today. Outside counsel on her left, Miriam Chen, who had been practicing corporate governance law for 26 years, and who wore the specific expression of someone who had seen worse than this, and recently. Brennan Shaw positioned near the door, not at the table, present as a factual witness if required. Marcus on her right, with the documentation binders, 1 copy for each board member, identical, organized with the systematic thoroughness that he did better than anyone she'd ever worked with. Hargrove arrived 3 minutes late, which she suspected was deliberate, a small dominance signal, the kind of thing that worked in rooms where no one had done their homework. He had his own attorney with him, which told her he had been expecting something. He sat at the far end of the table with an expression calibrated to project mildly affronted convenience, as though this meeting were an imposition on a man with more important things to do. The other board members, 7 of them, including O.C. and Firth, arranged themselves with the careful neutrality of people who understood something significant was about to happen and had not yet determined which direction to face. Vivienne opened the meeting without preamble. She laid it out in order. The subsidiary exposure, the option agreements, the financial motive, badge cloning, the timer relay, the footage of Gerald Foss. Payment trail from Foss back through the consulting firm to Hargrove's network. She spoke for 40 minutes, and she spoke without drama, because the documentation was dramatic enough on its own, and she had learned a long time ago that the most powerful way to present a devastating case was to let it be what it was without decoration. Hargrove's attorney interjected twice. Vivienne's outside counsel handled both interjections with the efficient economy of someone deflecting minor obstacles, which is what they were. When she finished, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms went quiet when everyone present was privately recalibrating. Hargrove looked at the binder in front of him. He had not opened it. He looked at his attorney. Something passed between them, a small recalibration, visible if you knew what you were watching for. "Richard," Vivienne said. She used his first name deliberately, not warmly but directly. "You can contest this formally, and if you do, we will proceed through whatever process that requires. Or you can resign from the board effective today, return the proxy shares to the trust structure outlined in the original shareholder agreement, and we move forward without a public proceeding." She paused. "I want to be clear, this isn't a negotiation. The terms are what they are. I'm giving you the choice, because giving you the choice is the correct way to handle this." Hargrove looked at her. His expression had dropped the affronted convenience somewhere in the middle of her 40-minute presentation. What was underneath it was something more honest, a man who had made a calculation and gotten it wrong, confronted now with the specific discomfort of having underestimated someone he'd spent 6 years treating as a category rather than a person. "You had a child doing your intelligence work," he said. It was not quite contemptuous. It was the last thing he had. "I had an 8-year-old who paid attention," Vivienne said, "and a man who took her seriously. That's the whole story, Richard." I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just didn't dismiss the things that mattered. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at his attorney and said, "Draft the resignation letter." The letter was signed and delivered before noon. Vivienne stood at her office window afterward and looked at the city the way she'd looked at it from the conference room 10 days ago. And she felt something she was careful not to mislabel. Not triumph implied that she'd wanted a fight, and she hadn't. She'd wanted to build 12 properties across 6 cities and design them correctly and prove that the expansion worked. The board proceeding had been a wall she'd had to go through, not a destination. What she felt, more accurately, was the specific exhaustion of a thing that had required everything finally being finished. Marcus knocked and entered without waiting, which he did only when he had something she needed to hear before she'd finished being relieved. "O.C. asked to speak with you, separately." Vivienne turned from the window. "When?" she called while you were still in the room. "Said this afternoon, if possible." Renata Ose had been on the board for 4 years. She was 61, a former development finance executive, and had the particular quality of intelligence that expressed itself more through listening than speaking. She had voted against the expansion in preliminary discussions and had had sidebar conversations with Hargrove that placed her in the circle of peripheral concern. But she had also, in the board meeting this morning, been the first person to speak after Hargrove's attorney began drafting the letter, and what she had said was, "I want the expansion vote rescheduled for next week." Full board, with the investor update included in the briefing materials. It was the most decisive thing anyone else in the room had said all morning. "Tell her 3 o'clock, Vivienne said. Renata arrived at 3 and sat down across from Vivienne's desk with the directness of someone who had not come to manage an impression. "I want to be transparent with you about something," she said. "Richard approached me 6 weeks ago with a version of the story that was not what I heard this morning. He told me the expansion's financial projections had been inflated and that the investor interest was softer than you were representing to the board." She paused. "I didn't act on it. I didn't vote against the expansion in the emergency sense. But I asked fewer questions than I should have, and I was more skeptical going into last week than the evidence warranted." Vivienne looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to notice that I was in a position to be used, and I was partially, and I'd rather say it directly than let you find it in your own review." Renata's expression was careful, but not defensive. "I owe you that. You also called for the expansion vote to be rescheduled this morning. Because it was the right thing to do. That's not an offset." She paused. "I'm not here asking for anything. I'm here to be accountable for my part, which was being credulous with someone who had a financial interest in undermining you." Vivienne sat with that for a moment. "Do you believe in the expansion?" "Yes. I did before Richard's conversation and I did after it, which is why I didn't act. I just let doubt sit in the room." She looked at her hands briefly. "I should have brought it to you directly." "Yes," Vivienne said. "You should have." Renata nodded. She accepted that without deflection. "I'd like to keep working with you," Vivienne said, "if you're willing to do it differently going forward." "I am." "Then we'll proceed." Vivienne paused. "The expansion vote next week. I want you to review the full investor report before then, not the deck, the full financial model. If you have questions, bring them to me directly. I want a board that interrogates the numbers because the numbers deserve interrogation, not because someone with an agenda has preceded a conclusion." "Understood." Renata stood. At the door she stopped. "The program you're building, the accessibility initiative. I read the preliminary notes Marcus circulated. It's early still. It's important. And I think it has implications beyond the development properties." She looked at Vivienne. "I'd like to be involved if the offer is open." Vivienne considered her. Come to the working session next Tuesday. Come having read the preliminary notes and the demographic research and with at least one question I haven't thought of yet." Renata allowed herself a small smile. "I can manage that." She left, and Vivienne turned back to the window again. The afternoon had gone gold, and low the particular winter light that made the city look like it was made of something warmer than glass and steel. She thought about 12 buildings, about lobby rooms and quiet spaces and adjustable lighting, and what it meant to design something for people rather than around them. She thought about Cole in that conference room, describing what spaces communicated before anyone said a word. She picked up her phone and typed, "Board meeting resolved today. Wanted you to know." His reply came 20 minutes later. He was probably with Piper. It was after school hours, and it said, "Good. How'd it go?" She thought about how to summarize 40 minutes of documentation and 30 years of careful accounting, and one man's decision to build his empire using other people's trust as raw material. She typed, "He underestimated what an 8-year-old could remember." Pause. Then they usually do. She put the phone down and went back to work. Cole started the new role on the first Monday of March. He came in during the day for the first time, which disoriented him slightly. The building looked different in daylight, the lobby full of a different category of noise, the staff running a different rhythm than the quiet of the overnight hours he'd worked for 14 months. His office was on the 4th floor, small and practical, with a window that faced the interior courtyard rather than the street. He didn't decorate it. He put Piper's most recent ship model on the windowsill, a 3-masted schooner with a deliberately asymmetrical foremast, and that was enough. The first week was administrative. HR briefings, system access, security credentialing at a different level than his maintenance badge. He met with Vivienne's facilities team, her events management director, the architects who were handling the Northern Expansion's first 2 properties. He asked questions and took notes in a small notebook that he kept in his back pocket, the same way he'd kept field notes in a different life, in a different context, when the stakes for not remembering correctly were considerably higher than they were now. He found that he was good at this work in a way that surprised him, not because he lacked confidence in his skills, but because he hadn't expected the job to feel purposeful so quickly. He had spent 3 years choosing stability over meaning a deliberate trade that he'd made with his eyes open and that he did not regret. Predictability was a form of love when your child needed it to feel safe. He understood that and still understood it. But this was different. This was stability and meaning occupying the same space, which was rarer than people acknowledged. He also, in that first week, had dinner with Vivienne and Lila on a Wednesday evening. It was not planned as dinner specifically. He had stayed late for a working session on the first property's community room design, and Vivienne had been in her adjacent office finishing the last of the board documentation. And at some point Lila had appeared. Donna had brought her. Since Vivienne was running long, and Lila had assessed the conference table, covered in architectural drawings, and said, with complete composure, "You got the proportions wrong on the quiet room. The entrance is too narrow. It'll feel like a throat." Cole and the architect had looked at each other. Then they had looked at the drawing. Then the architect had said, "She's right." Lila had sat down at the end of the table and spent 20 minutes explaining what she meant, using language that was partly technical and partly analogical and entirely precise. The entrance to the quiet room needed to be wide enough to feel like an invitation rather than a passage. The threshold mattered psychologically. You communicated welcome or tolerance through threshold width, and tolerance was not the same as inclusion, and you could not design for genuine inclusion while communicating tolerance. She was 8 years old. After the architect left, Vivienne had looked at her daughter and said, "How did you know about threshold psychology?" Lila had looked mildly surprised at the question. "I know what it feels like to walk through the wrong kind of door." The 3 of them had ordered food to the conference room because it was nearly 7 and no one had eaten. And they sat around the architectural drawings and ate Thai food from containers while Lila talked about bioluminescent organisms and Cole talked about the sonar systems he'd worked alongside during specific deployments that were unclassified enough to describe, and Vivienne sat between them and ate her noodles and thought, "This is the strangest and most comfortable evening I have had in a very long time." She didn't say that. She filed it in the category of things that were true, and that she was still learning how to be in the presence of. After Lila fell asleep on the conference room couch, exhausted from 3 hours of architecture criticism and bioluminescence, wrapped in Vivienne's cardigan with her notebook pressed against her chest, Cole and Vivienne sat at the end of the table, with the takeout containers pushed aside and the architectural drawings still spread between them. "She should be involved in the design process," Cole said. "She's 8. She identified a threshold problem in 30 seconds that the architect had been looking at for 3 weeks. He looked at the drawing. "I'm not saying put her on the payroll. I'm saying when you're reviewing Community space designs, bring her in. She knows what she's describing. Vivienne looked at her daughter asleep on the couch. The cardigan had slipped off one shoulder and she looked younger asleep, the focused intensity that animated her face all day going soft, leaving something quieter underneath. My mother used to say I'd turned Lila into a project, she said. Came out before she'd fully decided to say it. Cole looked at her. She didn't mean it cruelly. She meant that I manage Lila the way I manage everything else. Systems and support structures and careful preparation. She paused. She said, Vivienne, your daughter needs a parent, not a project manager. Were you both right? Cole said. She looked at him. What? You can be managing something and loving it at the same time. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He considered his words for a moment. After Sarah died, Piper's mother, I ran Piper's life like a logistics problem for a while. Every meal, every school morning, every playdate. Checklists. I needed the structure because without it he stopped. Started again. Without structure, what I actually felt was right there. And what I actually felt was that I had no idea how to do this alone, and I was terrified of getting it wrong. He looked at the drawings on the table. The checklists were real love. They just weren't the whole thing. Vivienne was quiet. Your mother was probably right, he said. And so are you. Both at the same time. She thought about the 32nd floor suite and the 11 books and the 6 years of careful management. She thought about Lila telling her, things never settle down. You always say soon, and then there's always something. She thought about the hexagon drawing and the threshold psychology and the 3-month-old complaint that the blue light near the stage flickered every 9 seconds, which Vivienne had promised to check and never had, because she'd been managing 17 other things. I miss the flickering light, she said. Cole looked at her. The night of the gala. She told me the blue light near the stage flickered every 9 seconds. I told her I'd have it checked. She paused. I never did. I was already moving on to the next thing. He didn't offer her absolution on that. He just looked at her steadily and said, is it still flickering? I had it fixed the next morning. Then it's done. That's not I know it's done. I mean, she stopped. I mean that I do that. I mean that she notices things and I respond to the crisis. But I don't always follow through on the small things because I'm on to the next fire. Yeah, he said it simply. Not as an accusation. Piper used to leave me notes. Little pieces of paper on the kitchen counter. Dad, we're out of the blue toothpaste. Dad, my library book is due Thursday. Dad, you forgot to sign the field trip form. He was quiet for a moment. I thought she was being helpful. It took me about a year to understand she was keeping track, because she wasn't sure I would. Vivienne felt that land. What did you do, she said. Started keeping a different kind of list. Not tasks, more like a log of things she'd said. Things she'd mentioned. Things I'd told her I'd look into. He paused. Just so there was a record, so I could come back to them. He looked at Vivienne. You don't have to be perfect at this. You have to be consistent enough that she knows the things she says don't disappear. Vivienne looked at her daughter. Lila's notebook had fallen open on the couch beside her to a page of hexagons, some complete and some partial, the asymmetrical ones and the correct ones mixed together without hierarchy, just pattern extending wherever it needed to go. She thought, builders usually make things slightly wrong on purpose. The wrong part is the part they're interested in. Tell me about the first property, she said, because she needed to move toward something concrete. And because the conversation had reached the edge of a territory she wasn't ready to name yet, with Cole sitting 3 feet away and her daughter asleep on the couch. Cole looked at her for a moment. Recognizing the shift, she thought, but not pressing it, and then he pulled one of the architectural drawings toward him, and they spent another hour talking about entrance widths and lighting levels and what it meant to build a room that said, you were expected here before anyone opened their mouth. It was after 9 when Cole left. He had to be home before Piper's babysitter reached her limit, and they both understood the arithmetic of that. At the conference room door, he stopped the same way he'd stopped in the conference room. That first evening, not hesitating, just pausing with the particular deliberateness of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether the moment was right. Next Wednesday, he said. Piper has a half day at school. She's been asking about the building. He looked at Vivienne carefully. If Lila was interested in meeting her, if that's something that makes sense, Piper could come in for an hour. Vivienne thought about Lila at breakfast. I'd like to meet her. I'll ask Lila in the morning, she said. She'll tell me yes, or she'll tell me specific conditions. Either way, I'll let you know. Something in his expression relaxed slightly. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic person. She was learning but enough that she noticed. Good, he said. He left. Vivienne went back to the couch where Lila was sleeping. She sat down beside her daughter and looked at the open notebook. The hexagons spread across the page in their imperfect pattern, some of them wrong on purpose, some of them just wrong, and no way to tell from the outside which was which. She reached over and pulled the cardigan back up over Lila's shoulder. Lila didn't wake. She made a small sound, not quite a word, more like punctuation, and curled her hands slightly around the notebook. Vivienne sat beside her in the quiet conference room, with the city spread out blue-dark beyond the windows, and the architectural drawings still covering the table, and she thought about all the things she was still learning how to do. There were quite a few of them. The list was longer than she would have admitted to anyone at the beginning of this year, and shorter than it would have been if none of this had happened, not the gala, not the corridor, not the service elevator and the folding chair and the quiet voice asking a small girl about beetles and the 230 million years they'd been getting things slightly wrong and surviving anyway. She thought, you don't have to be perfect at this. You have to be consistent enough that she knows the things she says don't disappear. She took out her phone. She opened a new note. She typed blue light near stage fixed. Threshold width on quiet room correct per Lila. Ask Lila about Piper Wednesday morning. Then she stopped. Added one more line. Bioluminescence, look it up. She'll want to talk about it. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at her daughter. She stayed exactly where she was. Part 5. Piper Maddox arrived at the Callaway Grand on a Wednesday afternoon in March carrying a canvas tote bag, a half-eaten granola bar, and the specific energy of a 9-year-old who had been sitting in a classroom since 8 in the morning and was done with structured environments for the day. She was taller than Vivienne had expected. Dark-haired like her father, with the same quality of watchfulness in her eyes, though where Cole's watchfulness was practiced and controlled, Piper's was simply natural. The unfiltered attentiveness of a child who observed things before deciding how to feel about them. She wore her school uniform with one sock pushed down and her collar slightly crooked, and she looked at the Callaway Grand's lobby with the same expression she probably wore in front of things she was considering whether to build. Cole introduced them in the lobby. Vivienne first, then Lila, who had been standing slightly behind Vivienne with her notebook in both hands. Piper looked at Lila. Lila looked at Piper. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Piper said, "My dad said you know about beetles." Lila considered this. "I know about a lot of things. Beetles are one of them. Do you know about ships?" "Not very much. I know about the ocean below ships." Piper seemed to find this a reasonable division of knowledge. "We could trade," she said. Lila looked at Vivienne briefly, a check, not a request for permission, just an acknowledgement that she was making a social decision, and then looked back at Piper. "Okay." They walked toward the elevator together, not side by side, exactly parallel, with the careful spacing of two people who were interested in each other, but hadn't established the physical grammar of friendship yet. Vivienne watched them from 3 steps behind and felt something so ordinary and so enormous at the same time that she didn't know what to do with it except walk forward and not ruin it by remarking on it. Cole fell into step beside her. He watched the girls the same way she did, careful, not wanting to interfere with whatever was happening between them. "She talked about it the whole drive here," he said quietly. "Piper. She asked me 6 questions about Lila that I couldn't fully answer." "What were the questions?" "Does she like ships? Does she have a favorite animal? Does she prefer window seats or aisle seats? Does she like quiet or does she just need it?" He paused. That last one I thought was pretty perceptive for 9. Vivienne looked at the back of Piper's head, the slightly crooked collar, the one sock down. "What did you tell her?" "Told her I thought Lila both liked quiet and needed it, and that those were different things and she should ask Lila herself." "Good answer. I've been practicing," he said without irony. They spent the afternoon in the community room of the 4th floor space that Vivienne had repurposed as the program's development studio, a large, naturally lit room that Lila had approved because the windows faced east, and the afternoon light came in at an angle that was warm without being aggressive, and because the entrance was wide enough. There were architectural drawings on one table and Piper's tote bag on another, and at some point Piper produced a small, partially assembled ship model from the bag and set it on the table without explanation, and Lila had examined it for 3 minutes in complete silence before saying, "The mast is intentionally wrong." Piper had looked at her. "How do you know it's intentional?" "Because the rest of it is too precise. You're too careful to make that mistake accidentally." Piper had stared at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Nobody's ever noticed that before." "People don't look carefully enough at things that are almost right," Lila said. "They think almost right means finished." After that, the conversation between the girls had moved at a pace and depth that periodically required Cole and Vivienne to exchange a look across the table, the parental look that meant, "I don't entirely follow this, but I think it's good." They talked about deep-sea pressure and how ships were designed to float in spite of physics that should sink them. And Lila explained bioluminescence with a precision that made Piper immediately want to look up anglerfish. And Piper explained why the asymmetrical mast was the most important part of the ship in a way that connected directly, without either of them planning it, to what Lila had said the previous week about things that were interesting because of their wrongness. At 4:30, Donna arrived to take Lila to her afternoon routine dinner, then the nature documentary she was currently tracking, then the specific pattern of wind down that kept her nights stable. Lila said goodbye to Piper with the directness she always had. "Same time next Wednesday?" Piper looked at her father. Cole looked at Vivienne. "I think that can be arranged," Vivienne said. Lila nodded, satisfied, and left with Donna without ceremony. Piper watched her go, with the expression of someone who had been expecting to perform and discovered instead that they could just be. "She's really smart," Piper said. "Yes," Cole said. "She doesn't pretend to be less smart so you feel comfortable." "No, she doesn't." Piper considered this. "I like that." She picked up the ship model and began fitting 2 pieces she'd left separate in transit. Most people pretend to be less than they are. It's exhausting to watch. Cole looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at the ceiling briefly. "Can I have a snack?" Piper said. "I finished my granola bar in the car." The Ashford Sensory Access Program launched publicly in June, 14 months after the night of the gala. Vivienne had not rushed it. She had resisted, repeatedly, the pressure from her communications team to announce early, to generate interest, to control the narrative before the narrative controlled itself. She had told them, "We announce when we have something real to announce, not when we have something good enough to put in a press release." Her communications director had accepted this with the particular patience of someone who had learned which battles to pick. What they built in those 14 months was not a checklist. It was not a policy document or a diversity initiative or a line item in an annual report. It was something that Cole had described early in the process as infrastructure rather than accommodation, the difference between designing a building with stairs only and adding a ramp later versus designing from the beginning for every body that would walk through the door. The first 2 northern expansion properties opened with sensory-informed design, built to every communal space from the ground up. Entrance thresholds wide enough to feel like welcome. Lighting that was adjustable at the room level, not just the building level, with controls accessible to anyone rather than managed by staff. Quiet spaces beside every major gathering room, not closets repurposed under pressure, but rooms designed with the same architectural intention as the rooms they were adjacent to, because the message a room sent depended entirely on whether it felt like a feature or an afterthought. Trained staff at every event, not with a special designation that marked certain guests as needing management, but with a baseline competency that was simply part of the job. The program also included something that had emerged from a conversation between Lila and Piper on their 3rd Wednesday together, when Piper had asked why quiet rooms were always white, and Lila had said, "Because the people who design them are trying to remove stimulation instead of replacing it the right kind, and those are different problems with different solutions." They had presented this to Cole and Vivienne the following week with a hand-drawn document, Piper's precise diagrams, Lila's written annotations that outlined what they called a sensory palette, a range of specific textures, sounds, and visual patterns that were calming rather than simply absent. It was not professionally formatted. It contained 2 spelling errors and 1 drawing of an anglerfish that had no relevance to the content, but that Piper had included anyway. Cole had photographed it and sent it to the design team, who had incorporated it into the quiet room specifications for properties 3 through 5. When Vivienne told the architects where the sensory palette guidelines had originated, one of them, a woman who had been in practice for 30 years, had been quiet for a moment and then said, "We've been designing these spaces wrong for decades." "I know," Vivienne said. "How did they know?" "They live in them," she said. Program expanded to include a training component, a curriculum for event staff, hospitality workers, and facilities managers developed with input from families, educators, and adults with a range of sensory and neurological differences. Cole ran the safety and physical design elements, a specialist consultant named Dr. Anya Reeves, who Renata Osei had recommended from her network, and who turned out to be one of the sharper people Vivienne had worked with in years, handled the human interaction training. Renata herself had taken on a board-level advisory role for the program with the specific focused energy of someone trying to do better than they'd done before, which was the best version of accountability Vivienne had encountered. The press response, when it came, was real, not in the way of a manufactured announcement, but in the quieter way of something that people recognized as genuine before they could articulate why. There were profiles and features, and an interview that Vivienne did in which she said, without planning to say it, that the program had started because her daughter ran across a ballroom toward a janitor, and the janitor had understood something about her daughter that an entire room full of educated and accomplished and well-intentioned people had missed, and that she had decided the least she could do was build something from that. The interviewer had asked, what did he understand that the others didn't? And Vivienne had thought about that corridor, about Cole shutting off the polisher, about the specific quality of attention that didn't perform patience but actually practiced it, about Beatles and 230 million years and an almost smile that knew better than to arrive too quickly. He listened before he decided what her behavior meant, she said. Most people do it the other way around. That quote ran widely. She hadn't expected it to. She had not said it for effect. That was probably why it did. The second annual gala was held on a Saturday in November, in the same ballroom. Vivienne had considered changing the venue and decided against it. Not because she was sentimental, she was not particularly sentimental as a matter of character, but because the Callaway Grand was her building and the ballroom was where the work had started, and there was something right about returning to the same place changed rather than finding a different place to pretend the change had always been easy. The ballroom looked the same from the outside. Same chandeliers, same Portuguese marble, same amber light that made everything seem more significant than it probably was. But the room beside the ballroom was different. It had been converted in August into the first flagship quiet space, with the wide entrance and the adjustable lighting and the sensory palette that 2 9- and 10-year-old girls had designed in the functional, misspelled way of people solving a real problem rather than a theoretical one. And there was a sensory station just inside the main ballroom entrance, unobtrusive, staffed by 2 people who wore no special designation, but who knew how to read a room and knew what to offer, and knew equally well when to offer nothing at all. Vivienne had arrived early, as she always did, and had walked the room alone before anyone else arrived. She did this at every event, not from anxiety, though there had been a period in her life when it was that, but from the habit of knowing exactly what space you were about to be responsible for. She walked the perimeter and checked the quiet room, spoke briefly with the staff at the sensory station, and then stood at the edge of the stage and looked at the empty room and thought about what she wanted tonight to be. She wanted it to be the kind of event where nobody had to decide in advance whether they could handle it. She thought that was enough to want. The guests arrived. 530 this year, more than last, drawn by the program's growing visibility and by the expansion properties that had opened to the kind of response that justified projections her investors had once called optimistic. The Seattle group was there, and the Meridian group, and several new faces that Marcus had spent the better part of the fall cultivating. Renata moved through the room, with the ease of someone who had relearned how to inhabit a space she'd been uncertain in, which was its own kind of quiet victory. Cole arrived at 7, which was early enough to help with a last-minute issue in the AV system that had nothing to do with sabotage and everything to do with a cable that had worked perfectly in rehearsal and was currently not working perfectly in practice. He fixed it in 9 minutes because he had made it his business to understand every technical system in the building. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because understanding the systems was how he stayed ahead of the problems. Brennan had stopped looking vaguely affronted by Cole's operational instincts approximately 4 months ago, and had since developed the habit of checking Cole's read on things before finalizing security assessments. Cole did not comment on this development. He just showed up prepared and let the results speak. Piper was there too, with Cole, for the first part of the evening. She was not in school's uniform. Tonight she wore a dark blue dress that she had clearly negotiated with some effort, because Cole had mentioned that Piper had opinion formal wear that were mostly negative, but she had agreed to this one because, in her words, it had pockets. She carried the most recently completed ship model in the canvas tote bag because she had promised Lila she would bring it, and she wore her hair down in a way that suggested someone had made a genuine attempt with it, and she had accepted that attempt without fully endorsing it. Lila met them at the entrance. She was wearing a dress she had chosen herself, dark green, soft fabric with no scratchy seams, which had been the primary criterion, and her hair was in 2 braids that Donna had done and that Lila had approved after inspecting them for symmetry. She had her notebook in her coat pocket. She always had her notebook. When she saw Piper, she said, "You brought it." I said I would. "I know, I just wanted to confirm." Lila looked at the canvas bag. "Can I see?" Piper pulled out the ship a brigantine this time, 2-masted, with a slight rake to the foremast that was either the wind or a deliberate miscalculation, and possibly both. Lila turned it in her hands. She found the wrong part in about 30 seconds, which was longer than last time, which meant Piper was getting better at hiding it. "Here," Lila said, pointing. Piper grinned. It was a real grin, the unguarded kind. "Took you longer. You hid it better." Lila handed the ship back. "It's improvement." "That's the point," Piper said. Cole watched his daughter and felt the specific thing a parent felt when they saw their child being seen correctly by someone else. It was not quite pride, not quite relief. It was closer to the feeling of a held breath finally released, the long exhale of a worry you'd carried, so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. Piper had been better this year. Not fixed, he didn't think in terms of fixed, had learned not to. Had understood slowly that the word implied something broken, and she was not broken. She was Piper, and Piper was exactly who she was supposed to be inside a life that had handed her very hard things at a very young age. But she had laughed more. She had filled 3 notebooks with ship designs. She had joined a model building club at school that met on Tuesday afternoons and had come home from the 3rd meeting talking so fast he'd had to ask her to back up twice. She had, last month, looked at the photograph he kept on the kitchen shelf of Sarah, laughing at something off camera, the summer before everything changed, and said, without preamble, she would have liked Lila. Cole had looked at the photograph. Yeah, he'd said. She would have. She liked people who were exactly what they were. Piper had gone back to her current ship. Not many people are. He had not said anything else because there was nothing else required. Piper had made her peace with something in that moment in the small kitchen of the apartment where they had rebuilt their life together, and peace didn't need narration. He thought about that now, standing in the entrance of the Callaway Grand's ballroom, watching his daughter and Lila walk together toward the quiet room they had partially designed to show Piper the finished version. He thought about the distance between where they had been and where they were. He thought about the ways distance could be measured by time, by difficulty, by the specific number of mornings he had stood in the kitchen making lunch for a child who had gone quiet and tried to figure out how to reach her across the silence. He thought, it doesn't happen like a switch. It happens like weather. You don't see it moving until one day you look up and the sky is different and you realize it's been changing for a while and you just weren't watching at the right angle. Vivienne found him at the entrance 5 minutes later. She'd been working the room. There was a sequence to how she moved through these events. A map she worked with practiced efficiency, but she came back to the entrance and stood beside him, and they both looked at the ballroom for a moment without talking. She was in dark red tonight, not the elaborate formality of last year's gown, something simpler, deliberate. She looked like herself, which was a thing he'd noticed about her over the past year, that the more he knew her, the more clearly he could see the difference between how she presented in a room and who she actually was, and the gap between the two was narrowing. She was letting it narrow. He didn't know if she knew she was doing it, but he thought she probably did, because she was one of the more self-aware people he'd met, even when the self-awareness arrived late and at inconvenient moments. Piper took Lila to see the quiet room, he said. Lila texted me a photo already. Vivienne showed him the phone. The photo was of the entrance wide, lit warmly, a small detail of the wall texture that had come from the sensory palette document, taken from the perspective of someone standing exactly in the threshold. Titled it correct. Cole looked at the photo. High praise, extremely. She put the phone away. The brigantine made it? In the tote bag. She wouldn't let me carry it. Or the ship. Both, technically. Vivienne smiled. It was the smile she had that was different from the professional. One less composed, less managed, the one that happened when she wasn't thinking about managing it. He had been cataloging the difference for months, the way you catalog differences that mattered, without quite yet saying out loud why they mattered. How are you? She said. She asked it the way she'd learned to ask things not as a greeting formula, but as a real question with real patience behind it. Good, he said, genuinely. He looked at the room. You? She was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about last year. Standing where you're standing now. Watching Lila cross this floor and not understanding what was happening. What do you understand now that you didn't then? She thought about it. He liked that about her. She didn't answer reflexively, didn't reach for the first available response. She actually considered. I understand that I had been protecting her from the wrong things, she said. I thought I was building walls against difficulty. I was actually building distance. She looked at the ballroom. She didn't need fewer hard things. She needed people willing to stay in the room with her while the hard things were happening. Cole said nothing. That was the right answer, and she'd arrived at it herself, and it didn't need his endorsement. I also understand, she said, more quietly, that I hadn't let anyone stay in the room with me, either. Not really. She looked at him sideways. I was very good at making sure I was the only person managing the difficult parts. I noticed, he said. I know you noticed. She paused. You didn't say anything about it. It wasn't my business yet. The word yet sat in the air between them. Neither of them moved toward it or away from it. It was there, and they both knew it was there, and the knowing was enough for now. He had thought about this, what it was that had grown between them over the past year, in the working sessions, and the Wednesday afternoons and the family dinners that had started as accidental and become deliberate, and were now simply part of the structure of the weeks. He had thought about it the way he thought about things that mattered, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion, before he understood what he was actually looking at. He was not a man who moved fast toward things he couldn't afford to get wrong. He had learned what it cost to lose someone essential. He had rebuilt his life with Piper as the foundation, and he would not disturb that foundation for anything that wasn't real and lasting. He was sure of that. He was sure of other things too, things that had grown surer over months of proximity and conversation, and the specific experience of watching someone refuse to be who they weren't, even under the considerable pressure of who they were expected to be. He was not going to say any of that tonight. Tonight was the gala, and there were 500 people in the room. And in approximately 40 minutes, Vivienne had a presentation to give, and Lila and Piper were coming back from the quiet room, and the work that both of them had spent a year building was about to be in front of everyone who needed to see it. But he thought, yet. He thought that word had a direction and a destination, and that was enough for now. You should go work the room, he said. You've got 40 minutes. I know my timeline, she said dry. I know you know. She straightened slightly the small internal shift he'd learned to recognize as her preparing to be professional in a room that required it. Then she paused. Cole, yeah, thank you for this year. She said it directly without performance. Not the program, the other parts, the Wednesday afternoons, the conversations at 9 o'clock after the girls are asleep. She looked at him. You didn't have to give that time. I wanted to give it, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had sometimes the look that went past the professional distance and found whatever was actually there. I know, she said. I'm learning to accept things that are given without looking for the terms. He held her gaze. How's that going? Better, she said. It's going better. She walked into the ballroom. He watched her go, watched the room shift around her. The small gravitational adjustment that happened when she entered a space, and the space recognized someone who knew exactly what she was doing in it. She moved through the guests with the efficiency of long practice, and he could see the places where the efficiency softened when it didn't need to be efficiency, and those places were more frequent than they'd been a year ago. He was still looking at the room when the girls came back. Piper arrived first, tote bag on her shoulder, with the expression she wore when she'd seen something that met her standards. Lila was beside her, notebook now open, writing something without looking at the page, the way she processed things she wanted to remember. Quiet room is right, Piper said. The texture on the left wall is exactly the way we drew it. We made one change from your drawing, Cole said. Corner angle. Too sharp in the original created a visual tension in the peripheral field. Piper considered this. That's a good change. Lila caught it in the review. Obviously, Piper said, with the easy confidence of someone crediting a peer. Lila looked up from her notebook. She looked at Cole, then at the ballroom, then at the stage. Mom's presenting soon, she said. About 40 minutes. Lila looked at the stage for another moment. She'll be good at it, she said. Same tone as last year. Same factual certainty, she practiced. She did, Cole agreed. Lila looked at him. She had her mother's quality of attention when she used it, the look that found what was actually there rather than what was being presented. You make her less worried, she said. Cole looked at her. When you're here, Lila said, she stops managing things for a little while. She just is somewhere. She returned to her notebook. It's important. People need to be somewhere sometimes instead of always managing. Piper was looking at her father with an expression that was 9 years old and also somehow considerably older. He said nothing. He had learned from both of these girls that some things were better received in silence. Can we get something to eat? Piper said. There's a cheese thing near the bar that looks good. You're 9. You don't need to be near the bar. I need to be near the cheese. There are servers. The servers keep walking past. She looked at him. Dad. Cheese. He looked at Lila. You want anything? Lila closed her notebook. The crackers without seeds. Piper knows which ones. She does know which ones. Piper confirmed, already moving. They followed her, and Cole found himself walking through the Callaway Grand's ballroom on a November evening with his daughter, and another man's daughter, and something that felt, unexpectedly and without drama, like the texture of a life he recognized as his own. Not the life he'd planned. Not the life he'd had before. Something that had been built from the available materials, grief and work, and 2 little girls who saw wrongness as interesting, and a woman who was learning to let things be given without looking for the terms. He thought about the phrase Piper had used months ago. About Sarah, she liked people who were exactly what they were. Not many people are. He thought Vivienne was. He thought it had cost her something to become that way. He thought the cost had been worth it, and that she probably knew it was worth it, and that knowing it didn't make it simpler. He thought, the wrong part is the part they're interested in. The wrong part is the part that shows you what someone actually is when nothing is performing. He had met Vivienne Ashford while mopping a ballroom floor. She had met him the same way. Neither of them had been presenting a version of themselves in that service corridor. There was no infrastructure for performance in a situation that urgent and that strange. They had just been who they were, which was 2 imperfect people making imperfect decisions in real time, and something real had started from that. He thought that was probably the best origin for anything worth having. The presentation began at 9. Vivienne took the stage in dark red and spoke for 68 minutes to a room that was more full of genuine attention than rooms of that kind usually were. She talked about the expansion, the numbers, and the properties, and the cities, but she also talked about the program. And she talked about it in the language of someone who understood what they'd built, rather than someone reciting what they'd been told to say about it. She talked about threshold width and sensory palettes and the difference between accommodation and design. And she said, "The most important thing I have learned in the past year is that being heard is not a special provision. It is the baseline. Everything we build should start from that." Lila watched from the quiet room, where she had retreated 20 minutes in, when the applause became too repetitive, not because she was struggling, but because the quiet room was there and good and hers to use. Piper sat beside her, both of them visible through the glass panel that Lila had specified during the design review. She'd said she wanted to be able to see the room without being in it, and they had built it that way. Cole stood at the back of the ballroom in approximately the same position where he had stood 14 months ago, with a floor polisher and a gray uniform. The room looked different from here now. He looked different from here now, though he was wearing clothes that were still not quite formal, and his hair was cut the same practical way, and he was still the kind of person who noticed the baseboards before he noticed the chandeliers. When the applause came at the end, real applause, sustained, the kind that happened when a room was responding to something rather than performing the response, Cole clapped with everyone else and looked at the stage and thought about the various distances he had traveled to be standing in this exact spot. He had traveled 12 years of service in conditions that most people would not understand and could not be adequately described to someone who hadn't been there. He had traveled 3 years of grief that had worn a gradual groove in him, not diminished him exactly, but shaped him the way weather shaped things it passed through repeatedly, leaving contours that hadn't been there before. He had traveled 14 months of night shifts and quiet floors and the ordinary anonymity of work that asked nothing of him except to show up and do it right. He had not expected any of that to lead here, but he had also learned, over the course of a life that had not gone the way he'd planned it, that the things you did not expect were usually the ones that mattered most. The ones you planned for were the foundation. The ones you didn't plan for were the rooms you actually lived in. He had a daughter who built ships with intentional imperfections and had started laughing again. He had work that was purposeful in a way that he hadn't looked for and found anyway. He had a woman across a ballroom who was learning to accept things that were given without searching for the terms, which was one of the braver things he'd watched a person try to do. And he had Lila, who had looked at him once and said, "You make her less worried. You make her just be somewhere." He thought, "I'll take that. Take all of that." When Vivienne came off the stage, she walked directly toward the quiet room rather than working the floor. He watched her navigate the crowd, and he watched the moment she found Lila through the glass panel, the way her shoulders dropped, the small particular exhale of a mother who had been holding something and could now set it down. She went inside. He could see her crouching beside Lila, the way she always did, not towering over her, not managing from above, but getting to her level and being in the space with her. He watched Lila show her something in the notebook. He watched Vivienne read it and look up and say something. He watched Lila almost smile. Piper appeared at his elbow. "She's showing her mom the drawing," she said. "What drawing?" "The one she made during the presentation. She draws when she's processing something." Piper looked through the glass. "She said it's for you." Cole looked at Piper. "For me?" "That's what she said." Piper studied the glass panel with the same expression she wore when she was deciding whether a mast angle was correct. "I think it's probably hexagons, but the wrong kind." He looked through the glass. Vivienne had stood up. She was looking at the drawing, and then at Lila, and then toward the glass panel, and when her eyes found Cole through it, she held his gaze for a moment in the way she did sometimes past the distance, past the management, at whatever was actually there. She held up the notebook so he could see. It was hexagons, an extended pattern of them, spreading across the page in Lila's careful hand, some precise, some deliberately off. Angles that should have been equal, made unequal in ways that made the whole structure more interesting than it would have been if it were correct. At the center of the pattern, small and precise, Lila had written 4 words. Cole read them through the glass. The wrong parts matter. He stood at the back of the Callaway Grand's ballroom, in the same spot where 14 months ago he had been nobody that anyone in this room would have noticed, and he felt the specific, unperformable thing that happened when a life you hadn't planned turned out to be more than you'd known to ask for. He nodded at Vivienne through the glass. She nodded back. Piper was already walking toward the quiet room entrance, drawn by Chi's proximity, and the gravitational pull of her best friend on the other side of the door. Cole followed her. The room was warm and correctly lit, and the entrance was wide enough to feel like welcome rather than passage, and he walked through it without hesitating. He didn't need to hesitate. He was expected.